Wow, I am just honored and delighted to be here and be a part of this celebration of such a wonderful man. And I've got a lot of friends and heroes here, and I'm making a lot of new friends and new heroes. I should say I didn't know Henry, never met him. But I like the image Frederick Buechner gives where he says, in the ongoing love story between God and humanity, every once in a while, God drops a handkerchief down to earth to leave the scent of heaven with us. And I think Henry is one of those people who have the scent of heaven on them. And so I'm honored to share with you a little of our journey and what we see happening in the church. But I'm going to stop and go kind of off script and zoom in on the particular places I can see the fingerprint or the scent of Henri Nouwen on our work. I want to say, to start with, I had no idea who Henri Nouwen was when I grew up until, I don't know, maybe college, because I grew up in East Tennessee, and I'm going to say I was a very good kid. I was a straight A student, went to Sunday school every week. I was prom king. It was a small town that I'm from, but I had, all that going for me, and I ended up starting to read the things that Jesus said. And that's when everything went haywire. I meet these folks all the time that are like, well, my life was such a mess. And then I met Jesus and everything came together. I'm like, God bless you. I had my life pretty together. I met Jesus and he messed me up. I'm still like kind of recovering from my conversion. But I grew up Methodist. I grew up in the United Methodist Church, and there were so many things I loved in the Methodist Church. I felt loved. And that's so great, because I know not everybody felt that in the church, but I felt that. But it was also a lot of the congregations I went to, there wasn't the fire, like sometimes. And sometimes we got talking about all these other things. I remember one of my friends as a pastor, he said, yeah, I'm getting pretty discouraged with the church because our trustees are all arguing about whether or not we need a heater in the baptismal, because it's kind of uncomfortable when people get baptized. And he said, Jesus died on a cross, and we can't even stand to get in cold water, And I started to see some of that, and I started reading the stuff that John Wesley said. And John Wesley was a wild guy, he said, if I find money in my hands, I get rid of it as quick as I can, lest it corrupt my heart. He said, if I die with more than 10 pounds, may every person call me a liar and a thief, because I betrayed the gospel and the poor. I was talking to Methodist bishops, and I said, the great question is, if John Wesley was alive today, would he be a Methodist? Like three of them liked that joke. But it was like I started to see like those contradictions. So I sort of kind of left, and I went on this journey, sort of looking for something else. And I joined a wild charismatic church, because they had the fire, and they didn't have any money. People were like getting slain in the spirit and healed and stuff, and I hadn't seen any of that before. I became a believer in miracles, really. And I still am. But then some things kind of went wild there, where we had this thing called Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames. I don't know if you've seen this, but if you haven't, I do not recommend it. But it was like this thing where we sort of had pyrotechnics and skits, and they were really scary skits. Skits are usually kind of scary, but these were really bad ones, and it was like all the kids would be on a bus, and the bus would wreck, and all the kids would die, and the demons would come and get the kids that didn't know Jesus and take them to hell. And my friend's dad was the devil, and he was good, every night we'd get born again. Even a couple of the pastors rededicated, I think. It was scary, and then there kind of came a point for me where I realized, at the end of the day, I didn't choose Jesus because I was scared to death of hell, or because I wanted crowns and mansions in heaven. I chose Jesus because he's beautiful and he's lovely, and this is a where I love how Henri Nouwen, as we heard earlier, talked about Jesus not just as the Christ, but Jesus as someone he knew and loved. And I think we've got to rekindle that love in the way that Henri talked about it, because we don't always talk about Jesus as one we love. You know, some of what I hear about God makes me see that there's a God that's easy to fear but hard to love. And the Jesus I've come to know is love incarnate, you know, and it's that which it's so funny to me when some of my evangelical friends, they say, oh, well, Catholics, you know, they don't believe in a personal relationship with Jesus. I'm like, well, Mother Teresa actually talked about Jesus as her spouse and her lover. It doesn't get much more intimate than that, you know. And I look at so many of the folks like Henri that saw Jesus as this love relationship. And I think if we're really in love, you talk about the one you love and it becomes natural. But sometimes it's like we've stopped talking about Jesus. And I wonder, like, if I wasn't excited to talk about my wife, like, do I really love her? Like, I love her. And I think we got to talk about Jesus as one we love. And there's one mainline denomination that will go unnamed, but there was a study that came out that surveyed them and showed that they shared about Jesus with one person a year. And someone had said, well, you know, the gay issue is really dividing our denomination. It's going to be the end of us. I think it's fracturing us in every direction. And my friend said, no, actually, I think what's going to be the end of you is you don't share your faith with anyone. You know, and then the study later came out. They said, we have actually done another study, and we think it's less than one person a year. You know, I don't know how you share your faith with like half a person. But, you know, that's kind of like, I think we've got to rekindle that love. And that's what happened for me is I fell in love with Jesus. And then what became dangerous, I started reading the stuff he said, you know, and that's where, like, I saw Jesus saying, if you want to be the greatest, you should become the least. Jesus saying that the last will be first and the first will be last. And I heard a preacher say, if we find ourselves climbing the ladder of status and success, we better be careful, or else on our way up, we'll pass Jesus on his way down. You know, I began to see that the story is about a God that comes and leaves all the comfort of heaven to join the struggle here on earth. Born as a baby refugee in the middle of a genocide and dies broken on a cross. And the story of God entering our suffering calls us to be near to the suffering, but we love to sugarcoat it. You know, when one pastor, I was talking about at Christmas, it's the worst, you know, where we're supposed to remember Jesus. He says, but at Christmas, like, we do everything else. You know, we buy stuff for people that have everything. We decorate everything. We got all this clutter and stuff that we fill Christmas season with. And he said, this one Christmas was very interesting. And he said, as they were getting ready for the Christmas service, they had everything decorated, you know, decked out with the red and green and the Christmas tree on the altar and the wreaths and lights. And then he said, but then before the Christmas service, I was praying at the altar and I felt God begin to do something in me. And it felt like God was telling me to take down all the decorations. I think it came, Steve, in a little red thing that said, take down the decoration. You know, but anyway, and so, like he said, take down the decorations, take down the decorations. And so he said, I'm not one to say no to God, so I started ripping it all down, you know. And he's like, I'm going to have some old ladies that are going to be mad about this, you know. And he said, he started taking it all down. And then he said, it got weirder. He said, I felt God calling me to redecorate the altar, but it was like I needed to go out to my farm and bring back the manure. And so he said, I did it. I scooped up a bunch of the horse manure, and I came back, and I threw it all over the altar and down the aisles. And he said, and the next morning was awkward. You know, everybody came and they're ready for the, you know, Christmas cantata and all the songs and the Christmas service. And they get there and they just start smelling this. And he said it was awkward at first, but then he said it's one of the most powerful services we've ever had. We felt the Spirit move among us. And we remembered that the story is about God entering into the crap. into the pain, into the suffering, into the broken stench of our humanity, and living with us in that brokenness. And so it's, that as we look at the trajectory of the kingdom, I've come to see that it's a very different direction from everything in the world that's compelling us to move away from suffering, right? To move out of neighborhoods where there's high crime or people that don't look like us. And yet the gospel, the gravity of the gospel moves us towards the pain and towards the suffering. And yet, man, I didn't know really where to start. So when we were in college, like we just we're reading Henri Nouwen, we're reading all this stuff, and we said we got it all in theory, but we got to figure out how to do it in practice. And so when we started thinking about who's really doing this, we really liked Mother Teresa, and so we said she's doing it. She's left stuff to follow Jesus, and we need to figure out how to learn from her. So we wrote a letter, and we just said, we don't know if you give internships out there in Calcutta, but we'd love to come and work and live among you. And we're still pretty evangelical, so we like prayed over the letter and we sent it off. And every day I'd go and check my postal box to hoping I had a letter from Mother Teresa, and it never came. And but when you're 20 years old, no one's convinced you that anything's impossible. So we just started calling nuns, and like, we want to work with Mother Teresa. Can you help us out? And most of them thought it was a prank call, but finally we got a hold of the sisters, the Missionary Charity in the Bronx. And this one woman, she gave me a number, and I called, and I'd done my homework, so it was late at night when I called, so it would be, a decent hour in the day in India, and all my friends are around. We're calling from a payphone in our college dorm, lounge, and I'm dropping quarters like nobody's business, and young people, payphones were these things that we had that you put, anyway. So, like, so I'm calling, and the phone rings, and I'm expecting, sort of a polite greeting on the other line, like, Missionaries of Charity, how can we help you? Or something. And I just hear this raspy old voice, hello? I'm thinking I got the wrong number, and the quarters are going fast, And so I said, I'm trying to get a hold of the Missionaries of Charity or someone in Calcutta. We're calling from the United States, and we want to come over and work there. We're trying to follow Jesus, and we need some help. And then she goes, this is Mother Teresa. I'm like, that'll do, and I thought about saying, yeah, right, and I'm the Pope, but I didn't, I just kind of processed this, and I'm like, okay, and I'm trying to tell my friends, it's her, we got this, and I said, well, we want to come work, and she says, well, come on. And she didn't have the Southern accent down, but, like and then I start thinking very logically. I'm like, okay, where are we going to sleep? What are we going to eat? And Mother Teresa, she didn't fret a lot about that. So she says, oh, God takes care of the lilies and the sparrows. God will take care of you. Just come. I'm like, awesome. I hope that works with my mother. And so we went, though. We went, and we lived this incredible adventure, and it was there where I think I began to see the mystery of this sacrament of love that I actually read a great deal of Henri's writing before and during and after that trip to India. And it was that writing about sort of the mystery of what happens as we love and as we understand that we are loved. And it was also in India that I think I began to learn to pray differently. Growing up in Tennessee, it was like all of our prayer, it was very much about prayer requests. So we're going to take prayer requests. And everybody would sort of rattle off all the things, that we'd make a list, and one of my friends, he said, yeah, my kid was going up to pray, and he said, hey, I'm going to pray. Does anybody want anything? And so it's kind of like you're making a Christmas list, but it was in India, and it was from Henri that I began to see that prayer is something much altogether different. It's not just about us trying to get God what we want God to do. I mean, I think God cares about the longings of our heart, but prayer is much deeper than that. Prayer is us trying to get ourselves to do what God wants us to do and to become who God wants us to be. And it was in India, every morning we would pray these prayers that were about being filled with God's love so that we would become the hands and feet of Christ to the world. One of the prayers that the missionaries of Parity prayed then and probably still pray to this day is, let every person I come in contact with feel your presence in my soul. Let my hands be the hands of Christ and my feet walk as the feet of Christ to the world. And so it was that, it was also interesting because every morning we'd have communion, and the communion services, I just throw this out there as a confession, we would kind of duck out sometimes to miss traffic. And in India, I was like, whoa, that's not cool. In India, I learned the mystery of the Eucharist, that as one of the nuns we were talking, we were like, well, why do we do communion every day? And she's like, well, you've heard that saying, we are what we eat, right? That's what we're going for, that we would become what we eat, that we would become the body of Christ in the world, right? That we would live, that Christ would live in us, that we would be able to say, as Paul said, that the life I live, I no longer live, but Jesus lives in me. And when that became real was when I was working, in the home for the dying, and I worked every afternoon in the home for the destitute and dying in Calcutta. As Mother Teresa said, when we look in the face of the destitute and the dying, we can see Jesus in his most distressing disguises. And I began to see that, if you've been there, in Calicut, on the wall, when you go into the morgue, on the wall it says, I'm on my way to heaven. And when you turn around, it says, thanks for helping me get here. It was a holy place. It was a beautiful, joy-filled place, right? And then I spent some time. One of the places I lived was a village way outside of Calcutta, and it was a village formed with folks who had skin diseases, leprosy and other skin diseases. So they were totally ostracized and outcasts. And of course, Mother Teresa said these people are very precious to God. And so she formed a village with them where 300 families were living on this land. And one of the brothers had gone away, and so there was a vacancy, and I got to go and live and work there. And it was amazing to see community, to see this image of folks who had been totally shunned and stigmatized by everything in their culture, and yet it was this beacon of the kingdom of God on earth, a demonstration plot for God's kingdom. I mean, they grew their own food. They had their own fish hatchery. They had a wood shop that when they had their arms or legs amputated because of the disease, they would custom make a new arm or leg for each other. All of the blue and white saris that the missionaries of charity wear are made in this village, and they embraced me. My job, I worked with these two guys, and one of them was really, really old, and he had bad gas, and so every day he was just tearing it up, and we would all die laughing, and I'm like, this isn't what I imagined, being amongst the poorest of the poor in India. But I began to realize that they're like all of us, and that we can see in each other the image of God, that we're beloved. And they also began to open my eyes to the mystery of what it looks like for Jesus to live in and through me. One of my jobs there was to roll cotton balls, because they had all these cotton balls that they had grown. They grew the cotton and they pick it and put it in a big pile, and it was for the clinic, because all of the folks who had been treated for their skin disease, they were now the doctors, and they were treating others. And so folks were lined up and they're coming in, and I rolled cotton balls, and I'm sitting there rolling the cotton balls. And then day after day, one day, one of the doctors leaves, and he says to me, "You've been watching this, so it's your job now. Take over." I'm like, what? And I started, I had been watching, though. I did know what to do. I'd been watching meticulously. And so he gets up and leaves, and I sit down, and the next guy comes up, and this older gentleman, and his arm needs to be treated, and he puts it out, and he's looking at me, and I'm like, good to meet you, and I start treating his arm, and I do it the best I can, and I wrap it up, and then he says to me the beautiful word, namaste. And then one of the other fellows said, do you know what that word means? And I said, not really. I mean, I hear it all the time. I say it all the time. And he said, it's an incredibly holy word. And he said, you don't even have a real good translation for it in English. But basically what it means is the Holy One in me honors the Holy One in you. I see the image of God in you. And I thought for a minute, this man doesn't just see some goofball kid from America, but maybe he sees the image of God in me. And I certainly knew that when I looked back at him, I didn't just see some poor leper in Calcutta, but I saw the face of Jesus. And it's that which Henri learned and knew so well, that as we live with those who have been ostracized and hurt and shunned, we can see Jesus in his most distressing disguises, and they help us see ourselves a little bit better. I came back from India, and Mother Teresa had a great commission. She would say, Calcuttas are everywhere if we'll only have eyes to see. So find your Calcutta. You don't have to go to Calcutta to find Calcutta. Pray God would give you the eyes to see how to live out this love right where you are. So we came back to Philly, and we began to starting our community, and we basically just hung out with folks who were on the streets. We helped kids with homework. We were embracing Mother Teresa's idea that we can do no great things, but only small things with great love. So that's what we put above our door, is today let's do small things with great love, or not even answer the door. And that's what we started doing. But then, as you know, and here's something that I think is really interesting, is that I've become convinced that in the church, we don't have a compassion problem as much as we have a relationship problem. That we've grown out of proximity to the broken streets and to the suffering. I did a survey some years ago, hundreds of folks who self-identified as strong Christians. And I asked them, did Jesus spend much time with the poor? And over 95% said, yeah, Jesus spent time with the poor. Later in the survey, I snuck in a question, and I said, do you spend time with the poor? And it was 2% of these strong Christians who said, yes, I spend time with the poor. 98% said they didn't have meaningful relationships with folks in poverty on a regular basis. And I came to see that Mother Teresa was right when she said, it may become very fashionable to talk about the poor, but it's not as fashionable to talk to the poor. And we can talk about justice. We can talk about how God cares for the poor and still not know their names. And I think what happened to Henri, right, is all of that began to have a name, Adam. It began to have faces and stories that inspire us. And yet I think that's still a great challenge to what we live in right now, to where everything in our world is pulling us away from those people and those faces. Because when we live in proximity to those who are suffering, it keeps us up at night, right? It messes with us. And in Philadelphia, we began to see that our city started passing really terrible laws that were landing many of our friends in jail and with citations they couldn't pay. Philly, along with 50 other cities throughout the states, passed anti-homeless legislation, right? So it made it illegal to sleep in public places. Some of these laws made it illegal to sleep in public parks, illegal to ask for money on the streets. One law in particular was a feeding ordinance that made it illegal to share food with folks on the street. And that's where you kind of go, okay, so we're to respect the authorities, but we're to love our neighbor as ourselves. We cannot not feed folks. And so we said, we'll try to do this creatively, and we began to have public picnics. And but we started them with worship, like less intimidating, get the guitar and drums, play a little bit. And then we would serve communion, which was subtle, but you weren't allowed to have food. So we said, we're all Catholic, it's the body and blood. But anyway, then after communion, we kept breaking the bread by bringing in pizzas and stuff. And then we would sleep in the parks. And one night, while all of us were there, there were about 100 of us there sleeping in the park, and we had eaten dinner. And the police came in, and they arrested all of us. And we were taken to jail and charged with a bunch of stuff, but disorderly conduct was among them. And it's like, my mom is not going to be happy with this, and we, as we went to jail, we began to argue our case, and there were like 30 or 40 of us on trial, and we decided, we don't just need to speak for ourselves. We're going to invite one of our friends who's lived this struggle on the streets to speak for us. And so our buddy Alfonso, who we all knew as Fonz because he was a smooth talker, and Fonz agreed to represent us. And so we go to court, and I had a shirt on that said Jesus was homeless. And the first thing the judge does, he goes, "Come here. What's that mean? Jesus was homeless." And I said, "Yeah, Your Honor, in the scripture, Jesus says that foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Jesus was homeless. And the judge said, "You guys might stand a chance." And when it came to arguing our case, Fonzo stood up, and Fonz said, "On behalf of the group, I'd like to say that we believe these laws are evil and wrong." And then he sat down. We're like, "Yes, Lord." The district attorney wasn't amused by any of this. I mean, she's throwing a book at us. She wanted us to go to jail and serve time. She wanted us to have hours and thousands of dollars worth of fines paid. And this is a kicker. She wanted us to have hours and hours of mandatory court-sanctioned community service. No, anything but that, So... But it sort of felt like the Lord was with us. We ended up arguing our case, and the judge said this. He said, "You know what? What's in question isn't whether or not these people broke the law. What's in question are the laws that we're passing. If it weren't for people who broke the bad laws, we wouldn't have the freedom that we have." And the judge said, "Let me remind the court that if it weren't for people that broke the bad laws, we wouldn't have the freedom. From the Boston Tea Party to the Civil Rights Movement, the Underground Railroad. Don't we remember these things?" He said, "These guys are not criminals. They're freedom fighters, and I find them all not guilty on every charge." Dropped all our charges. And then he said, "And where can I get one of those T-shirts?" So I think it does something to us as we look at the world that we live in. It causes us to live in ways that don't compute. And Henri Nouwen is certainly one of those that lived into a trajectory of mobility that was very different from the trajectory of our world. And there's so many folks like that, right? Dr. Martin Luther King, at one point they said, you are maladjusted. And he embraced the notion. He said, "You're darn right I'm maladjusted. We live in a world that's become way too adjusted to injustice and racism and inequity." So I am thankful for maladjusted people. I think there's one chapter of Henry's life that's still unwritten, and that is, I think there's also just as we think of downward mobility, and we embrace Franciscan spirituality, and we talked about how we wanted to be poor with the poor, and then we started to talk to poor folks, and they were like, "Wow, why do you want to be poor?" I began to also realize that there is a degree of so-called privilege that comes with the idea of downward mobility. And some of my friends have taught me this well, that even as some of us from so-called privilege move downward, that God is also liberating people on the bottom, right? That God is also setting people free. And so there's kind of a dual track in the kingdom where the last are becoming first, but the first are becoming last. The mighty are being cast from their thrones, but the lowly are lifted. And the hungry are filled with good things, while the rich are sent away empty. So there's kind of a different way that the gospel interacts with us. And so some of us are on a track of downward mobility, but I also think some of us are on a track of being lifted out of oppression and marginality. And I think of one of my dear friends in Philadelphia who began to say, because you're from privilege, when people look at what you've done, you're a hero. All your peers think you're a hero because you've left privilege to move into a tough neighborhood. I was born here. And he said, when I don't leave the neighborhood, all my peers think I'm a failure. And if we're not careful, the way the narrative gets framed is in a way that your clout comes at the cost of another person's dignity. And so I think we've also got to be careful as we think of downward mobility, that there's some people that are down that didn't choose to be there, and God is lifting them up, And so I think there's that story. But then, eventually you come to the place where you just sort of realize that all of us are beloved children of God. And that's where I think, as Henri realized, as you live among folks who are hurting, you see your own brokenness more clearly. I hang out with a lot of folks in recovery. I think the church is a whole lot to learn from the recovery community of Alcoholics Anonymous and NA and these other groups, because you see your brokenness. And that's what as I think of Henri, one of the things that he talks so much about and so honestly about is his brokenness. And I think as we think of the church today, the world's not looking for perfect Christians, but they're looking for honest Christians. And so often we've acted like we're perfect. And then you end up having this vibe and aura in the church that is as if this whole thing is for people who have it all together. And I went to a church not too long ago, and all the greeters at the door had shirts on that said, "No perfect people allowed." That's good, that's good. No perfect people allowed. And so I think like that's part of the good news and part of what we've got to begin to be honest with if we're going to continue to reach a generation that is very aware that Christians are not perfect. That's why I like Rich Mullins. And I think the ripples of Henri's work have affected folks like Brennan Manning and Rich Mullins and folks in evangelicalism that you may not have even heard of. But Rich Mullins was a great singer and songwriter. I mean, he wrote so many wonderful songs, and I got to know him a little bit, and one of the things that he, like Henri, was very aware of was his own brokenness. And I can remember hearing one story he told where he was on a train, and he and his buddy are talking, and they're kind of having a little bit of a honest heart-to-heart, bro-down confession time, And they're talking as the train goes about some of their darkness, their sins and struggles. And then the train arrives, and this woman on the train comes up and says to Rich, she says, "Oh, hey, excuse me, but I can't help but notice that you look like Rich Mullins. Are you Rich Mullins?" And Rich said, in that moment, I thought of all the things she might have heard, and I had to decide if I was Rich Mullins. And he said, I smiled and looked at her and said, yes, I am. And it was owning his own brokenness. And I think that's what Henri invites us to do, is to own our brokenness. And if we can come from a place of not self-righteousness, but of confession today, we will be magnetic to a world that knows it's not perfect. But if we, like the Pharisees, stand up and say, thank you that we're not like those people, we'll continue to be haunted by the loneliness that we feel and the hemorrhaging of the church. That's why I love, the scriptures filled with such messed up people, or as Henri would say, wounded healers, right? That I grew up sort of seeing a sugar-coated version of all this, but then I look back and I'm like, Moses killed a man. He killed a man, right? Like David, a man after God's own heart. That's what I learned in Sunday school. But then you read 2 chapters of the Bible, and the brother pretty much breaks every command. He ends up coveting someone else's wife, committing adultery, and having her husband killed. He had a problem, he was a womanizer. He already had 6 wives and a bunch of concubines. I mean, the brother had a problem, and yet he hears a rebuke of God. And I love the first chapter of the gospel, Matthew chapter 1, as it leads up to the genealogy of Jesus, right? It goes, this was the son of the son of the son of, and then it gets to the David and Bathsheba thing, right? And it goes, and then Solomon was born. Right, you look careful, you notice this, right? And Solomon was the son of David, but his mother was Uriah's wife. That's what it says, right? It's like, don't forget, that was messed up, right? But God God's grace is bigger than our brokenness, than our sin. God works through the cracks, right? That's what lets the light come in. And it's that story of grace. Saul of Tarsus, a messed up man that looked more like ISIS than a saint for much of his life, right? Went door to door trying to torture and kill Christians, oversaw the killing of Stephen. And that's what drew my work around the death penalty, is I really began to say, like, if we believe that even a murderer is beyond God's grace, then we should just rip out half the Bible because it was written by them. The Bible would be a lot shorter without grace. It's a love story, isn't it? That's what I love about even the people we admire, is they're broken just like we are. You know, people like Peter. Peter, you know, the rock of the church. Like, I mean, when the soldiers come, he picks up a sword and cuts a guy's ear off, you know. And I think, like, you know, like he heard the Sermon on the Mount from the man himself, you know, and still picks up a sword. And Jesus scolds him and pops the ear back on, heals the guy. You know, it's incredible. Incredible. I mean, I think of that guy's story, you know, like he's having dinner at night with his kids, like, how's your day, kids? Kids are like, oh, pretty good. Got a lot of homework, you know. How's your day, Dad? Weird. We came to arrest this dude, and his bro cut my ear off, and then the guy we came to arrest put my ear back on. He was love and grace, right? And I think of Peter, you know. That's why one of my friends says, maybe we got the translation wrong. And it wasn't Peter, you're the rock I build the church on, but Peter, you're dumb as a rock, but I still am going to build my church on you. Because if ever Peter thought a little too highly of himself, you know, he's like, yo, I'm the rock of the church. I'm sure everybody would have been like, hey, remember when you cut that guy's ear off? Stupid. You know, like, what were you thinking? So that's why I think it's so beautiful that God prefers. It seems like not only can God use broken vessels, but God prefers broken vessels. Because then we don't take credit for the beautiful things God does. I mean, the paradox of God's wonderful love is that a stuttering prophet becomes the voice of God. A barren old lady becomes the mother of a nation. A little shepherd boy becomes a king. A homeless baby refugee leads us all home. That it's that place of the most vulnerable brokenness that we can imagine, where we see God's power, and we see it in the life of Henri Nouwen. I'll tell you one last story. I think is one of my friends was saying, sometimes we think it's all our gifts and credentials and titles and stuff. And he said, I learned a lesson. And he told me, he's an urban youth pastor. And he took a bunch of his kids from the inner city out to a retreat. And they're going out to this, you know, way out in the sticks retreat. And he's like, I was a little, you know, I'm a little nervous. I'm not sure if our kids from the concrete world of the city are going to connect, you know. And it's you know, this youth festival. And he's like, but then the wildest thing happened. He said, on the way out there, we had a flat tire. And so we're trying to fix the tire. And it went from bad to worse. It started raining. And the spare tire actually didn't fit the car that they were in. He's like, and eventually I just snapped and I lost it. I started punching the van and cussing it out. And all my youth group kids are looking on, you know. And he said it was awkward, you know. We finally, AAA comes or something, and they fix the tire, and they get back in the van. And all the kids are kind of sneering. And so, you know, they're driving, and it's very quiet. And like, man, did you hear him? Yeah, I heard him. Yeah. And they get there, and then one of the toughest kids ends up having this very powerful conversion, and he ends up dedicating his life to Jesus. And my buddy's talking with him afterwards, and he says, "What was it, man? Was it something in the sermon or like in the worship? Like what happened?" He said, "No, man, it was on the way up there when I saw you snap and start cussing the van out, and I thought, if Jesus can save you, Jesus can save me too." It's great, right? So it's not. Sometimes we think that our bruises and our scars are liabilities. But they can also be our credentials, right? That they allow us to speak out of that brokenness, that we can see that no one is above reproach and no one is beyond redemption. And that, I think, allows us to see that God can work through anything, even the most unlikely places. Rich Mullins said, you look at Scripture and God can speak through, make the rocks cry out. He says God can speak through a donkey, and he used to preach on that a lot. He said God spoke to Balaam through his ass, and God's been speaking through asses ever since. So if God should choose to use you, don't think too highly of yourself. And if upon meeting someone you think God could never use them, think again. Think again. And that gives us grace with other folks, right? Because I think, all the time I'm meeting folks that I was in Texas, and this guy said, Shane, I got to tell you, man, I am a redneck. He's like, I'm going to just throw it out there. I'm a textbook redneck. I drive a pickup truck. I drink whiskey, gun toting. I'm a redneck. And he said, but I've been reading your stuff, and it's messed me up. And he said, it got me reading the Bible again. That messed me up too. And he said, I want you to pray for me because I'm a recovering redneck. So what I love about Jesus is how he was able to bring everybody to the table. And that we're all being made into a new creation. It's the beauty of God's work. So let me close with the words of our brother. This is from Henri. Across all barriers of land and language, wealth and poverty, knowledge and ignorance, we are one. Created from the same dust, subject to the same laws and destined for the same end. With this compassion, we can say, in the face of the oppressed, I recognize my own face. And in the hands of the oppressor, I recognize my own hands. Their flesh is my flesh. Their blood is my blood. Their pain is my pain. Their smile is my smile. Their ability to torture is in me too. And their capacity to forgive, I also find in myself. Amen.